Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. This spring marks the 25th anniversary of Earth Day. What's happened? What lies ahead? Will mankind overwhelm Mother Nature, or will new technologies and economic progress enable us to tread ever more lightly upon the Earth? Joining us to sort through the conflict and consensus are Gregg Easterbrook, author of A Moment on the Earth, The Coming Age of Environmental Optimism; Portney, Vice President of Resources for the Future; Fred Smith, President of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which has just issued a new book, The True State of the Planet; and Robert Repetto, Vice President of the World Resources Institute, on the 25th anniversary of Earth Day. The topic before this house, the state of the Earth. This week on Think Tank. Since the first Earth Day was organized in 1970, much progress has been made toward a cleaner environment. And we've learned a lot about the real magnitude of some of the existing problems. First, the progress. The air over America is much cleaner than in 1970. Sulfur dioxide emissions, which cause acid rain, are down 53%. Carbon monoxide, down 57%. Smoke and soot are down 59%, and smog down 39%. Forests in America have made a huge comeback, expanding from 600 million acres in 1920 to 728 million acres today. World population more than doubled since 1950, but food production tripled. That means that for most of the world's people, food has become cheaper and more plentiful. In fact, the average price of food has dropped 70% over the past 25 years. Predictions that the world's population would about double from today's population to about 11 billion people by the year 2100 now seem off the mark. A recent projection by the World Bank says global population will most likely top out at 8 billion people in the year 2035 and fall to only 6 billion by the year 2100. And what about global warming? Burning coal and oil boosts atmospheric carbon dioxide, which traps the sun's heat, creating the so-called greenhouse effect. Computer models had predicted that the Earth's average temperature would increase by 0.4 degrees Celsius over the past 15 years. But now, satellite data show that temperatures have actually dropped slightly during that time. But there are serious problems. Here are two. Tropical deforestation continues at a rapid pace due to the expansion of slash and burn agriculture by poor farmers in the third world. And our oceans are in trouble. Overharvesting is depleting many fisheries. The first question today, if we could just go once around the horn, beginning with you, Gregg Easterbrook, is this. Your new book is called A Moment on the Earth. And I wonder if just briefly you could tell us what is the shape of the Earth at this moment?
My most basic message, Ben, is I think we are all about to become environmental optimists. I think the public understanding of the environment is an issue which for 25 years or longer has been driven by a constant descent toward pessimism and feelings of futility and decline, are all going to be replaced by optimism about the environment. I think the trends in the Western world are sufficiently positive and based on most of all the positive trends that you cite, based on early forms of pollution control that were rudimentary and not too sophisticated, and yet produced excellent results very cost effectively. I think those trends are so positive that, at least as regards the Western world, it's going to make us all environmental optimists.
All right.
Third world challenges, much different. Western world, good.
Robert Repetto.
I think the United States and Europe is in much better shape environmentally than the rest of the world because we started earlier and have worked harder at cleaning up the environment. Where we have problems are in the international environment and in the developing countries where environmental conditions are poor and deteriorating.
Portney.
Well, I think it's interesting that both Gregg and Bob share my view that conditions in the United States have improved dramatically since the first Earth Day. It seems to me the real challenge is to find a way to have the rest of the world have their GNP per capita, their income per capita grow the way it has in the United States without making some of the environmental mistakes we made along the way. That's the real challenge before us, I believe.
Okay, Fred Smith.
I think, well, we're all agreeing, I think that the alarmism, doomsday scenarios have been wrong. I think, though, there is a real challenge to find out what institutional arrangements make it possible for us to do as well in other areas as we've done, say, in food production. And I really believe that suggests that we move the bureaucrats out of the environmental area a little bit more than they've been and engage more people. That's what we did to make farming such an incredible success story over the last decades. If we began to employ some of the people power rather than bureaucracy, I think we've got an excellent chance of making the third world as successful ecologically as it is being economically.
All right, Paul, you said there had been environmental mistakes made along the way. I gather in the modern world. What were they, or what are they?
I think the mistakes were prior to 1970, having neglected the fact that the production of goods and services can generate serious environmental harms, and that unless some kind of action is taken, some kind of regulatory action is taken to make producers recognize those in product prices, then we're going to have damages that don't get rolled into consumer and producer decisions, and that led to the environmental problems that spawned the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in that first significant decade of environmental regulation. Once we had decided to regulate, I think we made some mistakes in the form that regulation took, notably very detailed, specific command and control type regulation, when in fact I think we might have done better to use economic incentives as a means of inducing environmentally desirable behavior on the part of producers.
I wouldn't think about that. I think some of the mistakes in our early history of resource use were that for almost 100 years before 1970, the United States was sort of in a developmental phase. We wanted to go develop everything. We subsidized the Corps to channelize rivers, the Bureau of Land Management to drain swamps, forests to be cut down non-economically. We weakened the right of private property owners to defend themselves against pollution. And then after all that, in a sense, government-induced encouragement of pollution, then we turned around and said, my goodness, we need more government involvement. That early government involvement, I think, did some good, but I think we neglected the role of private entrepreneurs in expanding the role of environment. I think that's the area I hope we revisit.
Robert Repetto, you agree with that sort of government as villain?
The government has done a lot of damage, and in many instances, the government denied that there were risks. Right. Remember, the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense assured people that atmospheric nuclear testing was safe. The Department of Agriculture and the agrochemical industry called Rachel Carson an hysterical woman for suggesting that DDT had anything to do with reproductive failures of birds. So the government has done a lot of harm, but entrepreneurial activity in the private sector only works in the right direction if the market signals incorporate the real costs of various kinds of production and consumption.
There are all kinds of problems with government regulation of environmental programs. The most obvious example that we all cite and believe in is Superfund for cleanup of toxic waste, where most of the money goes to litigation. And yet I think the most important message today is that most federal government programs and state programs in the United States have worked for environmental control purposes. We've gotten tremendous progress against smog in the United States, even as through the last 25 years we have more than almost twice as many cars as we did in the year 1970, driving more than twice as many miles as in the year 1970, and yet we have 40% less smog. We have tremendous cleanup in water pollution. 1/3 of rivers and lakes were safe for fishing and swimming in 1970. 2/3 are now. Most of our programs are working very well, and what really troubles me about the anti-regulatory mood on Capitol Hill right now is, of course, there are programs like Superfund that need to be reformed, but the Republicans, especially in the House, seem to want to indiscriminately throw out every program, incling the ones that have worked, and most of them have worked.
Let me just ask one question. Bob Repetto mentioned Rachel Carson. I am of the understanding that you do not share his view about Rachel Carson, which was that she was right.
I think Rachel Carson was wrong in the strict sense that the things that she predicted, widespread extinctions of birds, for example, or that's the main one, have not come true. But she was wrong for a wonderful reason, that her work inspired the reforms that prevented the doomsday she foresaw.
But Gregg, it also did something else. I mean, I agree that, look, it's useful to have people saying worry and concern, be care about the environment. But everyone now cares about the environment. We're all, in a sense, environmentalists. The question is, what do we do about it? And I think that first generation of environmental regulatory policies, which were essentially addressing the backlog of unaddressed needs, we're addressing, in a sense, haystack problems, the big lumpy problems. Crude methods could work there. We're now in a much more complex world. We're looking for needle and haystack problems in a way. And there I think the crude instruments of regulation are less likely to work. We need to go to, I think, devolution. The states ought to have more autonomy. You've said that they've been successful, but let's look at, you mentioned Superfund, but the asbestos program, which has been certainly no success story, or indeed acid rain. There's a lot of problems out there, and I think we really need to be much more creative in this new generation as we go forward than just to assume the regulations worked once, they'll work in the future. I don't think they will.
We do need to be more creative. Everybody, I think, is in favor of more market mechanisms and voluntary choice, and I think you can find a lot of places where that's going to be the next wave of environmental improvements. But we have to understand first that the first wave worked to make us optimistic that the next wave is going to work as well. And I certainly don't see that understanding in Congress.
But there seems to be a consensus, surprisingly, even from Fred Smith, that alarmism, call it Rachel Carsonism, works and is a necessary part of this political process. And yet you are saying, stop the alarmism, and somehow the progress will go on by itself.
I think
Now, is alarmism, or what some environmentalists have called lying for justice, is that a necessary part of the equation?
Some people will argue that scare tactics are actually good for the system because they force the system toward change that would have been ignored otherwise. I think that's not true. You eventually sacrifice your credibility. Alarmism is well justified when a genuine emergency exists.
Well, then it's not alarmism.
Well, yeah, then you argue over the word, right? When Rachel Carson wrote, vintage World War II bombers were passing over American cities and spraying them with Aldrin, a since banned pesticide, spraying kids with this stuff. It was crazy. There was reason to be upset and angry. Today, when we face the environmental problems of the West, alarmism is not called for. What you need now are rationality and optimism.
Do we need hype?
Well, let me mention that alarmism cuts two ways, and I think everybody agrees that there have been cases where the environmental community has been unduly pessimistic in its assessment of a problem, and it's probably goaded us into doing something that makes some sense. We should also point out, though, that the business community has a tradition of saying that that next regulation is going to put us out of business, lead to plant closures, cause product prices to double, and in those cases where we've been able to see what actually happened when a program has been put into place.
That's their alarmism.
That hasn't happened either. And I would argue that there's probably some benefit from that kind of alarmism, because on account of those claims, I think we now pay more attention to the fact that regulation does cost money, a lot of money, $140 billion per year in the United States. And I think that's led people in the environmental community now to pay attention to the cost of environmental regulatory programs.
Are you pro-alarmist?
Well, actually, where I disagree with Gregg in his book is that I don't think that environmentalists as a group are or have been alarmist or unduly pessimistic. I think that Gregg's book presents a caricature of the environmental movement. I don't know anyone, let alone the consensus of the environmental movement, who has referred to global warming as instant doomsday, or who has referred to dioxins as a hyper-toxic warp speed carcinogen, or who has said that nature can only produce harmful mutations and never beneficial mutations, all of which come directly out of this caricature. I think that environmentalists are basically optimistic.
All right, you have just been called an arch caricaturist in your new book. Why don't you give us
I wish I was good enough
a
to
short
be
form response?
an arch caricaturist.
Right.
A caricaturist. I use the term instant doomsday in my book, and advisedly to describe what I think is the package of the worst case views of environmental scenarios. And I think we get an awful lot of worst case views of environmental scenarios from institutional environmentalism. Sometimes the worst case turns out to be true, not often. And Dioxin is a great example. If you read the history of Dioxin, and I present some of it in my book, constantly described as the most unprecedented toxic ever known to man, able to cause cancer in very short exposures, very low doses. Dioxin is clearly dangerous and must be regulated, but the scientific findings since then have not held up the early caricatures.
Yeah, in a sense, Gregg, I think that in a way, Bob and you, I think, come down different sides of the alarmism side, but on the sort of the same side of regulation has been a good idea, but we ought to refine it a bit. I think we all agree with that. But in a way that alarmism has done something, I think, a great disservice, and by sort of creating a system of the sensational scare of the day, and EPA runs after that and then runs after another one, we've created almost like a butterfly scenario where we leap from flower to flower, never having any consistent set of priority setting. The major challenge today is to get some kind of rational priority setting into our environmental policies. It's not that we're doing a lot of sensible things foolishly at EPA. We're doing a lot of foolish things. Asbestos, Superfund, the dioxin fears. We really should find some more rational way than politics to go around deciding what it is we want to do in the environment. It's not as obvious as in that first generation when we had lumpy raw sewage floating in the rivers, soot discoloring our laundry. Today we're dealing not with a handful of criteria pollutants, but hundreds and hundreds of things, some of which we ought to address and some of which are trivial.
And if I could, that comes back to a point that Gregg made earlier. You were critical of the Republican legislative proposals for regulatory reform.
Sure am.
There are certainly some parts of those proposals that I'm very uncomfortable with, but there's a consistent thread through all of the proposals, including the more moderate proposal that Senator Roth has put forward, that would force regulatory agencies to use scientific evidence to help prioritize their risks more carefully. And I think that would go some ways toward addressing this problem of not going after the most serious problems first, that I think we all think the agency should do.
Let me bring up one issue, because several of you have mentioned the idea that while we are making substantial progress in the modern world, that the third world is still causing us great problems. And the keystone of that argument over the years, as I have seen it develop at least, has been that there is something going on in the third world called a population explosion, which is eating up resources and causing pollution, and so on and so forth. Now let me just read you something from the new publication of the World Bank. It's a long thing, and it says, "Thus we conclude that without a great deal of ultimately meaningless recomputation, the UN low population projection represents the best estimate of future population growth." Now that means, as we said in the setup piece, that instead of having 11 billion people a century from now, we are going to have 6 billion, give or take a billion or two here or there. Now that has been, and that was the bedrock of the whole explosionist argument, that it's going up and up and up and up, and nobody was, or very few people were prepared to say that curve is tilting downward, which we now seem to have established. Now, wasn't Repetto, wasn't that an example of alarmism?
Well, Ben, I mean, I've also followed population.
I know you have.
As
That's
you
why
know.
I asked you.
And firstly, recall that population has been growing at faster than geometric rates for centuries. And the doubling times of world population shrank and shrank and shrank up until very, very recently. Now, it's great news that population growth rates have leveled off and are starting to fall. Where demographers made their mistake was in assuming that once fertility fell to replacement level, it would stay there. But in fact, the experience is in most countries that once fertility falls to replacement level, which is about 2 kids per couple, it continues to fall right through replacement level, and that creates the potential not only for population stabilization at some point, but also for a decline in world population.
But what you're saying is that the alarmists were wrong. I mean, just wrong.
The projections were wrong, But to be concerned about doubling of world population in shorter and shorter periods of time, I don't consider to be a mistake.
Well,
I think there are substantial
but they were not only
grounds
wrong
for
on-
concern and still are.
But they weren't only wrong on population, they were wrong on food projections. They were wrong on the destruction of the atmosphere. For whatever reasons, the idea was the only way to get the attention of a political process was to be somewhat hysterical. Maybe they got the attention, but we've got the attention now. It seems to me that now a more realistic appraisal would make sense, but a political process is hard to draw into action. In a sense, by locking ourselves into politics, it seems to me we've locked ourselves into a level of rhetoric and hysteria that's going to be very hard to escape. Look, consider the world's food production. It's increased dramatically, not because politics got smarter, not because we're managing politically the world's agribusiness better, but because we got out of the way. We let people own land, we privatized the land of the world, and we've done a brilliant job of expanding world food production. If we could find ways of ecologically privatizing the world, of moving politics and bureaucrats out, and moving people in to protect the world's resources, forestry in the third world, we'd have a better world, a better environment.
I want to bring the conversation back to what's least interesting to the American viewer, and that is the third world, because I think that's where the great moral challenge of the 21st century lies. I've lived in Pakistan. I'm moderately familiar with the third world first up, and I think it's very encouraging that fertility rates are declining. It shows that the population will top out at a lower level than the doomsayers predicted. But you must bear in mind that the current world population of 5.5 billion or 7 or 8 billion, where it looks like the world population is going to top out, is ample to ensure decades of misery in the developing countries that can't properly support their current populations. And I think we in the West have a moral obligation to try to do something about it.
Hold on. I want to appoint each of you dictator for a decade of the whole world. You will do what Napoleon was unable to do, Caesar and whatever. But in the environmental realm, what would you do next if you could run the show?
In the West, transfer
Let's just go around.
In the West, transfer most programs to private market mechanisms, because I think things are sufficiently good here, we could now do that. For the third world, I would be giving away American technology left and right. I wouldn't be trying to sell it. I think it's our moral obligation to give it away. If we can spread clean technology to the third world, and there's a lot of indications that the Chinese, who are going to swamp everything we do in the West with pollution in the next century unless we help them, are interested in our technology, I'd just plain give it to them as fast as they'd take it.
Bob Repetto.
Ben, if I were a dictator and could dissolve Congress, I would immediately reduce payroll taxes and income taxes, and I would replace the revenues with taxes on energy, on waste generation, and on congestion, and in that way create market signals that put our incentives where our long-run interests are. Encourage those activities that make the economy more productive and discourage those activities that make the economy...
Doesn't the market, isn't that by definition what a market does, is encourage things that
only
work?
Only if prices reflect the full costs of doing things. And clearly, our coal prices do not reflect the full cost of burning coal. Driving in on the Beltway does not reflect the cost that we impose on other people. If we can get the market signals right and then unleash the entrepreneurs, we'll be in much better shape.
All right, Paul Portney of Resources for the Future, it is your turn to be dictator for a decade.
Okay, here, my two-point proposal for the United States is, first of all, make more use of economic incentive-based approaches to regulation so that we use the market that's been so efficient in producing private goods to help us get a better quality environment. And second, in the United States, return some of the regulatory programs that have been inappropriately nested at the federal level to the states. Moving abroad, I think the most important thing we can do is foster the growth of democracy, because I'm confident that in the long term, democratic governments will adopt market mechanisms that'll increase per capita income in those countries, and ultimately, I believe, the best thing we can do for the environment is give people a sense of economic security, because once they have that, they'll begin to care about the importance of the environment and the natural resource heritage that they could pass on to their kids.
All right. Fred Smith of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, what does a pristine libertarian do when he is dictator for a decade?
Certainly you resign your post at once, but then your advice would be to the rest of the people is to essentially do what works. Let's move away from the idea that daddy knows best, that government is the best approach. Devolve responsibility to states, localities, and to the private sector. Privatize as much as possible. Free up the world's economy so they can become wealthier, because a wealthier society is not only healthier, it's also cleaner for many, many reasons. The lessons America has to give to the world is what happens when you unleash, by devolution of property rights, how much creativity you unleash. We need to free that up for the ecological sphere, what we've done to the economic sphere. That's what we have to do if we really want integrating the ecology and the economy. We're not doing it by regulations.
Okay. Thank you, Gregg Easterbrook, Fred Smith, Robert Repetto, and Paul Portney. And thank you. Please send any comments or questions to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. Or we can be reached via email at thinktv@aol.com. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.